when ice met sand. Today, we're tracing the historical footsteps of a truly massive global supply chain to show how the Vikings weren't just these Western-rating barbarians of popular culture. They were actually highly connected global merchants who collided with the wealthiest, most advanced superpower of the era, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Let's dive in. Now, usually when we think of Vikings, we picture them sailing west, right? Attacking England or France. But a faction of Swedish Vikings took a completely different route. They loaded up their shallow draft longships and went east, navigating all the way down the massive Dnieper and Volga rivers. And this river highway dropped them right into the geopolitical crosshairs of the Caspian Sea and the doorstep of Constantinople. They weren't just looking for isolated monasteries to raid anymore, they were hunting for massive global trade hubs. What's really wild here is the sheer juxtaposition between these two worlds. Just think about it. On one side, you've got Scandinavia, freezing, resource-poor, populated by fractured tribes scraping by on a basic barter economy. Then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the Abbasid Caliphate. Centered in the intense desert heat of Baghdad around 750 AD, this was a highly centralized, technologically advanced empire living through a golden age of mathematics, science, and just unimaginable wealth. It's literally the ultimate clash of extremes. So when these Vikings hit those eastern markets, they found out their traditional goods, things like furs, honey, and wax, were in huge demand. But what did they want in return? Well, while the Byzantine Empire used gold, the Vikings were absolutely obsessed with the highly flexible Abbasid silver dirham. But here's the catch. They didn't care at all about the coin's base value. They operated on a bullion system. If they needed exact change, they would literally take an axe and chop silver coins and jewelry into pieces. They only cared about the tangible weight and purity of this hack silver. And to put the staggering scale of this global trade network into perspective, just look at this number. Over 800,000 Arabic silver dirhams have been unearthed in Scandinavia so far. 800,000. So we're not talking about a few lost boats accidentally bumping into Arab merchants here. This was a massive, highly organized economic artery flowing straight from the Middle Eastern deserts to the frozen north. Moving on to Section 1, the eyewitness, Ahmad ibn Fadlan. Back in 921 AD, the Caliph of Baghdad got a request from a northern tribe asking for an instructor in Islamic law. So he sends an emissary, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, on an epic 4,000-kilometer trek up to the Volga River. And there he comes face to face with these northern Viking traders who he called the Rus. His diary is absolutely fascinating because it gives us a raw, first-hand account of this massive culture clash. You see, coming from a society that strictly prioritized hygiene, Ibn Fadlan was just completely appalled by the Vikings. He literally wrote, "They are God's dirtiest creatures," noting with total disgust how a whole group of them would wash their faces, spit, and comb their hair using the exact same bowl of communal water every single morning. But his diary goes way beyond just complaining about their hygiene. He gives us this unparalleled snapshot of their society. He talks about their imposing physical presence, calling them tall as palm trees. He documented these extensive dark green and blue tattoos covering them from their fingernails all the way to their necks. And of course, he noticed they never went anywhere, ever, without an axe, a long sword, and a dagger. But the detail that really blew my mind, he noted they were wearing silk. That is definitive proof that these Vikings were plugged into a supply chain reaching all the way from the Swedish islands to the silk weavers of Beijing. He also witnessed and documented something deeply intense, a brutal ship burial ritual for a deceased Viking chief. It's an unflinching look at a society completely alien to his own. The chief was temporarily buried while his wealth was divided up. Then a slave girl volunteered to join him in the afterlife, a process where she was heavily drugged with intoxicants. An elderly matriarch who went by the terrifying title Angel of Death performed the sacrifice. Finally, the chief, the girl, along with sacrificed horses and dogs, were all piled onto a wooden ship and set completely ablaze. It really puts into perspective just how vastly different these worldviews were. Which brings us to Section 2, War and the disastrous attack on Barda. You see, as their hunger for silver kept growing, trade inevitably bled into warfare. The Vikings launched a massive armada of about 500 longships and captured Barda, a wealthy silk hub known then as the Baghdad of the Caucasus. This time, instead of a hit and run, they intended to stay and colonize. But talk about a terrifying technological mismatch. When the Islamic forces counterattacked, they deployed specialized squads called Naftun. These guys wore fireproof suits and hurled naft, which was basically a devastating early form of crude oil napalm. The Vikings, who completely relied on their highly flammable wooden longships, just had to watch helplessly as their entire fleet burned to ash. And if medieval flamethrowers weren't bad enough, the Vikings were actually undone by something totally unexpected. Local fruit. Yeah, you heard that right. Compounding their horrific burns, these cold climate warriors were completely unaccustomed to the heat and the local diet, and they vastly overindulged in Berdaz's sweet melons and figs. This sudden dietary shock triggered a massive, crippling dysentery outbreak that utterly broke their army from the inside out. The few survivors had to flee back north under the cover of darkness. Now for Section 3, the pivot to human trafficking. Realizing that fighting these highly organized, technologically superior Islamic armies head-on was, well, absolute suicide, the surviving Vikings pivoted. And they pivoted to a much darker commodity. They moved away from open warfare and focused on trade again, specifically human trafficking. They called their slaves thralls, people stripped of all legal rights and treated purely as property. Now, because Islamic law explicitly forbade enslaving fellow Muslims, the Vikings exploited this by capturing non-Muslim populations from Eastern Europe. In fact, the English word slave literally derives from Slav, which was the primary group the Vikings captured and shipped down the rivers to massive slave markets, like the one in the Khazar capital of Itil. This brutal human trafficking quickly became the backbone of a booming economy. Just one young, healthy captive could be exchanged for hundreds of pure silver dirhams. The Abbasid elites simply had this immense, insatiable demand for labor, whether it was domestic servants for their palaces or soldiers for their militaries. And the sheer scale of this operation is hard to wrap your head around. The Vikings established specialized holding centers as far away as Dublin, Ireland, just to manage the logistics of feeding this relentless demand.
Section 4. The end of an era.
So this intense cultural and economic exchange between the ice and the sand went on for nearly 200 years. But its collapse is a perfect illustration of just how fragile globalism was even 1,000 years ago. It's like a giant domino effect. In the late 10th century, the Panjshir silver mines, which were thousands of miles away in modern-day Afghanistan, simply ran dry. Facing a silver shortage, Arab rulers started debasing their dirhams by mixing in cheap copper. But remember, the Vikings were bullion traders. They weighed their silver. They immediately detected the impurity. So what did these purity-obsessed Vikings do? They just walked away. Almost overnight, this entire massive intercontinental trade network collapsed. Completely cut off from the flow of Arab silver, the Vikings had to look elsewhere. They turned their attention back to the fertile lands of Europe and began to assimilate. In the West, leaders like Harold Bluetooth Christianized Denmark, literally trading their pagan axes for Christian plows and integrating into the European feudal system. Meanwhile, in the East, leaders like Vladimir the Great established the Kievan Rus, blending Norse and Slavic cultures and laying the very foundations for what we now know as Russia and Ukraine. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We always tend to think of the Viking Age ending because of major military defeats or religious conversions, but the data points to a very different catalyst, a purely economic one. Think about it. If that silver had kept flowing from those Afghan mountains, and the dirham had remained pure, would the Vikings have ever assimilated? Or would the Viking Age have just kept going, forever reshaping the political and cultural map of the world as we know it today? It's a fascinating what if. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning history.